I'd like to welcome everyone to the King Center. My name is Kate Casey. I'm the faculty director here. If you're unfamiliar with the King Center, we are Stanford's university-wide hub. So we support research, we support training students, and we support convenings like this on critical issues facing the global poor. The impetus for this particular event, which you will not be surprised to hear, was the dramatic and extremely rapid evacuation of foreign assistance from wealthy countries to low and middle income countries that started last year. So recent data coming out last month from the OECD suggests that more than $40 billion of official development aid evaporated in 2025 alone. And so we want to meet this moment from two perspectives. So one, Bill Gates announced that he was accelerating the spend down of his foundation and made a historic pledge of $9 billion a year. And so we have Mark Sussman here, the CEO of Gates, and we really want to learn from him as being bold, innovative leadership in a time of crisis. Hear how he's thinking about strategic choices and trade-offs that are facing the Gates Foundation moving forward, and really celebrate them in terms of stepping in to the void. But the other side of that equation is 40 billion minus 9 billion is still $31 billion, and that's just in a single year. Forecasts are it will be worse for this year, for 2026. So then the question is, we need to get serious, and that's where you see confronting the new reality in the title of this event, because we need to bring a lot of diverse talent, and we really need to put a lot of our energy into thinking about new and creative ways to address that enormous shortcoming. And many of the countries that are going to be the worst hit in terms of the share of their gross national income that has just evaporated are in Sub-Saharan Africa, right? Which is a region that is already facing a number of acute challenges in poverty alleviation. So as King Center, we reached out to our colleagues, so Peter Blair Henry and Jendai Frazier, who run the Emerging Markets Working Group at Hoover, because we really wanted to work together to ensure that we had a very diverse set of perspectives, both in the audience and amongst our speakers. Because, historically in the United States, foreign assistance has been a very bipartisan endeavor, right? And we're hoping we can get back there in the United States, but more broadly, it's going to take everybody and a lot of creativity to address these urgent challenges that we have before us. It's my pleasure to introduce Stanford's president, John Levin, who is going to give a few opening remarks. And by way of introduction, I just want to share a story. So you may know before John became president, he was the dean of the business school here at Stanford. And over those years, I was a junior professor working my way up the ranks. And of course, there's many milestones, as in any career. But the big one is the tenure decision. And if you're not familiar with it, it's a pretty extreme up or down vote, right? You're kind of go in and you're getting a job for life, or you're effectively getting fired. So I got no, I'm not kidding. I got the phone call. John's waiting in his office, and I knew it was my turn, that I would find out if it was up or down. So I prepared myself. I was like, you know what? Gave it my all, I left it all on the court, I did my best, and if I don't get tenure, the most important thing to do is not cry in front of John. So I was like, I will go in there and I will walk out with my head held high, I will find a new job, and I will be grateful for the brief time I spent here on campus. So I walk in, and John says, Kate, good news. Congratulations. You've got tenure. Everyone's so excited for you. So what did I do? I was totally prepared for the downside. I had but zero preparation into the upside. But who was prepared? John Levin was prepared. He had a lovely little tissue box ready to go. He had one tissue fluffed, and he just slid that box across the table for me as I tried to put together the shreds of my dignity. So I am really excited that my former boss is now so many people's boss as president, because he is a terrific boss. So please join me in welcoming President John Levin.
Thank you, Kate. That was a really memorable introduction. Um, can I actually just say that if you spend your career at Stanford and you get to be a department chair or a dean, um, the single best discussion you get to have with people is if they get voted tenure, and you get to be on the other side of that discussion. So, Kate, thank you for giving me that incredibly joyful moment, and I appreciate you for that. One of the next best things is to see your students or the people that you were able to communicate tenure to ascend into more and more senior leadership roles. And we're very fortunate that Kate, a few years ago, agreed to be the director of the King Center for Global Development, which is hosting this event and which is Stanford's university-wide hub for all things global development, and brings together faculty and students from all over the campus and the 7 schools to talk about research, to have classes, and have events like this that convene people to talk about important issues in global development. Um, I don't think there could be a more timely topic than the topic that this conference is going to tackle today. Um, when I think Kate said it right, which is that for many years, the support for foreign aid and for global development has been an area that, at least in the U.S., had broad bipartisan support, and in many ways often was viewed as a sort of technocratic problem. That is, how could we find the best evidence-based approaches to public health, to education, to agriculture, to different areas where there could be investment. And for a place like Stanford, where we have a lot of researchers, social scientists, technologists who care about the developing world, who might have come from the developing world, who would like to do things to uplift people, to create more opportunity, it was has been an incredibly fruitful field, because you could bring your evidence-based thinking to bear on problems of health or technology or biomedicine, what have you, and feel like you were really making a contribution. And Stanford has sparked many careers. I was just talking to Mark Sussman from Gates about the incredible set of students who've gone off and done remarkable things in Africa and Latin America after graduating from here. And so to see that consensus break down in the last year and a half, it's really a setback. And I was thrilled when I heard that the King Center had responded to that by saying, okay, let's do something about it. Let's have some events. Let's get people together. Let's start talking about what's next. And I think that's a very Stanford characteristic. Look to the future, problem solve. Let's figure out what's next, and let's try to bring together some people who could really be insightful in thinking about that. And that's very much the spirit of this event, and thrilled that Hoover is partnering on it. We have an incredible set of people to speak today. Mark Sussman, the CEO of the Gates Foundation, the absolute leader among foundations in thinking about the developing world. Kate told me this morning that we seem to have 4 ex-ambassadors in the room. You'll have to sort of try to count them as the afternoon goes on, but that's quite a collection of people with policy expertise. And we've got some Jendaya and Peter and Kate are going to do some moderation. So we've got an incredible program this afternoon. I'm really excited that we have all of you here today to be part of this discussion, and thank you to the organizers.
Thanks so much, John. So the structure of the event, we're going to start with a fireside chat. So Mark Sussman and Peter Blair Henry is going to lead that, and he's the class of 1984 senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. And then my other collaborator, Jendai Frazier, who's the Peter and Frances Dugnan Distinguished Visiting Fellow at Hoover, she's going to take over, and she's going to introduce our other guest speakers, who are Ambassador Mike Green, Judy Moore, and Vera Songway, and then they will have a broader conversation, followed by open Q&A with the audience after that. So Peter, Mark, please take it away.
So good afternoon and welcome. Thank you, Kate. Thank you, John. It's terrific to be here. And Mark, welcome.
Thank you.
It's a great pleasure and an honor for me to give a quick sort of personal introduction of my friend and colleague, Mark Sussman. Mark is the CEO of the Gates Foundation, as you know, and he leads Gates' mission to help every person have the opportunity to have a healthy, productive life. Deeply committed to building partnerships and fostering a culture that drives meaningful impact, Mark is guiding the historic 20-year acceleration of the Foundation's mission ahead of its planned closure in 2045. During this time, the Foundation will spend $200 billion to ensure three things. One, no mother or child dies of a preventable cause. Two, the next generation grows up in a world without deadly, infectious diseases. And three, hundreds of millions of people break free from poverty, putting more countries on the path to prosperity and delivering more freedom to more individuals around the world. Mark knows a lot about the value of freedom. There's an adage, to whom much is given, much is required. Mark, having grown up in apartheid South Africa, embodies that adage. He understands what that means, and he has worked his entire life to combat injustice and inequality. I've seen it firsthand, and it's just a privilege to be on stage with you, Mark. So let's get after it and look forward, as John said. Welcome, Mark. Please give Mark a round of applause. So Mark, you've been at this for a long time. You started off as a journalist, and in the year 2000, I don't know whether this is well known to this audience, Mark moved to the UN and was right there at the inception, helping to deliver the implementation of the Millennium Development Goals. And so as the stage has been set, two things are true. One, these are really difficult, urgent times. And two, the world has made progress on development in the last quarter century since you moved over to the UN and then subsequently to Gates, even as that progress is currently under threat. So say a word about the progress and the threats, Mark, and how they drive your vision for the next 20 years.
Yeah, well, first, thank you, Peter. It's great to be here with you. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And thank you to the King Center for just hosting this, because I think it is a really, really important and timely topic. And yes, when you grounded in 2000, two things happened which turned out to end up having a very meaningful impact on my life. One was I just joined the United Nations. Kofi Annan was Secretary General, and we were part of launching what was the Millennium Declaration and became the launch of the Millennium Development Goals, which had these aspirations and goals, including halving extreme global poverty by 2015, 15 years later, trying to cut maternal and child mortality by 2/3 was the goal, making strides against infectious diseases, HIV, AIDS, malaria, tuberculosis. And those seemed very just aspirational pie-in-the-sky goals. Certainly there was a lot of criticism at the time going, well, what do you think? This is just the UN doing bullshit goals, frankly. Now, at the same time, across the country in Seattle, Bill and Melinda Gates were setting up a new foundation, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And it was founded with that mission that Peter just described, that every person deserves the chance to a healthy and productive life. And they were looking for areas of that, what is holding that back? Where are the greatest inequities domestically in the US and globally? And domestically, our biggest area of work, start with education, particularly K-12 education. And globally, it started looking at health, because you said, there are millions of kids dying of completely preventable diseases. The one that they were most noticing was rotavirus, which is saying, how can millions of kids be dying of a disease we've barely even heard of, where a vaccine exists, but it just isn't reaching people? So the two actually, while they were came together, and both the Gates Foundation and the UN were part of what became an extraordinary wave of development success over the following 15 years, especially in those health sectors. And so you did see at the 2000, over 10 million kids a year died of preventable deaths, kids under the age of 5. Flash forward to where we are now, in 2024, that number had dropped to 4.6 million. That's that's every year more than 5 million kids alive who would have died. Mm-hmm. Similarly, in the fight against infectious diseases, that was the peak of the AIDS epidemic. There were millions and millions of people that looked like there was no solution. That's what became the launch of the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria, which was launched at the UN, but with strong US leadership. The PEPFAR program, you will hear from Ambassador Mark Green in the next session, who was one of the leaders helping put that through Congress at the time. And everyone thought, this is not going to go anywhere. And you go, well, actually, in all of those, we made tremendous growth. Mortality in all of those diseases also halved. And that's millions of lives. So if you flash forward and you look back from 2025 to 2000, those two areas alone, providing vaccines for kids and providing treatment for HIV, malaria, and tuberculosis, it's conservatively saved between 60 and 70 million lives. And very cost effectively. Yes, it's been billions of dollars, but that's been done by leveraging the private sector, leveraging the public sector, putting together new alliances, the Global Fund that I mentioned, the Gavi Vaccine Alliance, those pooled philanthropic money, governmental money, and use the private sector, because the private sector is who manufactured most of those vaccines. They manufactured the antiretrovirals, manufactures the bed nets, and then works with the governments to distribute. And there was also huge improvements in poverty eradication, and it was globally distributed. While previous waves had been, yes, there was a China wave, some of it's in Southeast Asia. That period between 2000 and 2015 in particular saw a halving of extreme poverty in countries as diverse as Ethiopia, Ghana, Bangladesh, Rwanda, China and India, and the global impact was profound. But now we've hit a stage exactly at the inflection point where that has stalled and in many cases reversed. Attached to those cuts that Kate just described, last year there'll be a lag on the data, but it's very likely to have been the first year of the 21st century that preventable child mortality went up rather than down. Our estimates ago that an extra 200,000 kids died. Same thing with malaria, TB, and HIV. All of that progress has just stalled and has partly begun to reverse. And there have been massive setbacks post-COVID around the broader poverty and growth agenda across the global south, where combinations of debt, and you'll also hear on the next panel from Vera Songwe and others who are very expert on that, have meant that the resources that rich countries like the US had at the course of the pandemic to do big counter-cyclical spending and keep their economies afloat were just not available in low and middle income countries, who then ran up very large debts when inflation rates went up, have created huge economic constraints on their ability to drive development forward. And so we're at a key inflection point right now where the numbers of those cuts, as you just heard, are in the many tens of billions of dollars. And the needs are as acute as ever, but we're not going to be able to achieve the next set of goals with the same tools and the same approach we did in the last 25 years. And that's very much at the heart of what we're now trying to think about at the Gates Foundation with that new 20-year horizon you've talked about. This commitment to close our doors by 2045, but do it against an agenda which we think we can truly meet against the three goals you just outlined.
That's a great framing, Mark. And let's take that frame you've given us to look forward, as John encouraged us to do, and to do it in the context of those tremendous successes that you mentioned. And then in spite of those successes, there seems to have arisen this deep skepticism of aid and development and so on. But clearly the Gates Foundation has been able to bring reality as well as hope. And health and education are two examples where your approach of really bringing realism, partnership, and targeted interventions continues to make a difference. So I want to dig in now on how Gates is bringing the health aspect of that vision to life, Mark. And tell me, what's going on in this picture?
Yeah, other than my funny hat.
You have company in the funny hats.
Yes, so that's actually just from a little over a month ago. That's visiting a factory called Revital Healthcare in Kilifi in Kenya. It's near the Indian Ocean. And actually, it's a factory that we invested in at the peak of the pandemic in 2021, where there was a massive global shortage of syringes that were able to be used for vaccination. Vaccination requires very stringently made syringes because vaccines are, you're putting a vaccine into a healthy child. I think that suddenly there was a huge call for vaccine syringes, and as often happens, the supply was bought up almost largely by rich countries. Suddenly Africa didn't have syringes, even for routine vaccination, let alone COVID vaccination. So we made an investment. One was in Revital, and the other was to a factory in Rwanda to see if we could actually help support the manufacturing of those syringes in Africa and meet these very tough World Health Organization specifications, which are very rigid on the quality because you need to be so good, and make them cost effective. And the short answer is we managed to achieve all that. Today, that factory and the Rwandan factory can produce a large majority of Africa's syringe supply needs. They made a critical role in the pandemic, and they've now expanded up into new products, both diagnostics, and what you're seeing there is a special ventilator that can be used, a very low-cost ventilator for at-risk babies with respiratory problems shortly after birth, which they're doing at a cost that's a fraction of what the global cost is. And that, for us, is a great example of a model of where you can use and invest in local technology. So that's now rooted deeply in the Kenyan economy. It employs hundreds of Kenyan workers, the vast majority of them women. It's world-class. It actually now exports outside of Africa to Asia and Latin America. And it's a core resource that actually helps support public health in a deep way. And so we're constantly looking for what are the variants that we can do around that. Where can we do? Because it's now self-sustaining without us too. We made the initial investment, but we don't make continued investments. It now actually is revenue generating and is looking to expand in other parts of Africa and Nigeria and Morocco. And so that's a microcosm, if you like, of how we look to do, because it does need to then work. It depends on government procurement, and it requires the government of Kenya and other countries to be assuring they're procuring. It needs to work with the Gavi Vaccine Alliance that we talked about, which is still the major purchaser. And so what does that look like in other sectors? That's in the vaccine and syringe space, but we can look at it in pharmaceutical products. You can look at it in bed net provisions, which help you with malaria. But that's a kind of great model of how we try to operate. And it's about also building the institutions that are going to last after we're gone. As we said, we are a time-bound philanthropy. We will be gone by the end of 2045. And we don't be leaving a large gap the way the USAID cuts left huge gaps last year. We want to make sure there's an institutional infrastructure that's available, that some of the issues we hope will be solved. Like we're not going to need a global polio workforce because we believe polio will be eradicated. We hope malaria will be eradicated. But you will still need a functioning primary healthcare system. You will still need syringes. So what's that combination? And as we look forward, so much more of that is going to have to be driven from the countries and communities themselves. I think that's one of the big, healthy elements of what is an otherwise very disruptive reset that's being forced by the current budget cuts, is even though that aid in general was spent, well and healthily, and there's a lot of misrepresentation about, how aid was spent badly or not, that there is room for improvement. And there's room for spending it more effectively, and there's room for building that long-term institutional strength. But it also has to be embedded, what you had me describe up front, which is the success stories of the first 25 years. Because a big chunk of the skepticism about aid and why it has been so politically vulnerable is most people in the general public, if you do a poll in the US or any high-income country, and you say, do you think global poverty has gone up or down in the last 25 years? Most people think it's gone up. Do you think child mortality has gone up or down? Most people think it's gone up, or less stayed the same. And the truth is it's halved. We, the collective, those of us in this community, have not done a great job actually telling our stories, explaining how, in this case, US leadership, because in the global health space, the US has been by far the largest and most generous funder, both on the research side through the NIH and other partnerships and in the delivery side. And then how do we both rebuild support for that story, but make sure we're doing it in a way that's building long-term self-reliance in the countries where we work.
Look, I love the point that you make about kind of local ownership, global partnerships, which you've been doing for some time. Could you, I can't resist a follow-up question, but can you say a little more about how you see the prospects for that model continuing to take root and how that might scale? You guys have been doing it for a long time, but getting others to see. Any thoughts about that model? 'Cause that seems really critical.
Yes, so certainly we hope. I mean, the prospects, I think the medium to long-term prospects are very good. I hope because you show the models, you have the examples, and there is a focusing of attention. These cuts and disruption, say if there's one silver lining, and it's a pretty poor silver lining to a dark cloud, it's focused a lot of attention. If you go and talk a country across the global south in Africa or Asia, there's much more attention being paid to health issues and health financing, for example, from the finance ministry and the head of state of what traditionally used to be a health ministry discussion. Because a lot of it was coming through different bits of international aid or support. Again, important, but we think these discussions do need to be national discussions. They're about investing in human capital. The human capital is the people, saving kids' lives, making sure they have healthy nutrition, then making sure they have access to, say, education and the other tools. The human capital investments are the key to long-term investment, and that needs a whole-of-government approach, and that needs a whole-of-government approach that is supportive of these kind of public-private partnerships I'm talking about. So I think the political space is there, and the appetite. We've got the models. What's a little bit missing right now is, can we have the financing and the actual concrete partnerships, especially at this time where there's been such a big retrenchment?
Got it. So we'll come to financing, but let's turn to education for a second. So for the last 25 years, African countries have made remarkable gains in primary school enrollment, adult literacy, and other measures of educational attainment. But scholars worry that the learning gains are not as fast as the enrollment gains. So what are you doing to address the distinction between enrollment and learning? And if I understand correctly, you've recently been in the classroom yourself, Mark. So tell us about this and engagement.
Not sure that's the most flattering picture, but okay.
You're focused.
Yeah, I'm focused. I'm not sure how much they learned either, because my Xhosa is not very good, and that was their first language. But so education is actually, I say it is the counterpart to the human capital. When I talk about health and education as your two sort of core investments in human capital, which are generational investments. You don't get the return until the kid has grown up and been fully educated. It's a 20-year return. It's not like building a road, which are critically important issues, but you have a much higher return on investment much more quickly. And education of all sectors, and which we learned this the hard way in the US, where I say we've been working on education for 25 years. And when Bill and Melinda first started the foundation, I think thought that the progress in education would be huge, and that working in global health was a huge high-risk thing that probably wouldn't work. And 25 years later, we look, it's been the opposite. Actually, the global health successes have been immense and far exceeded what we thought would have been possible in 2000. But the education system, we've had key wins here and there. There are great models of different kinds of schools or education. But if you look at the aggregate educational outcomes, it's because there's a less clear thing between input and output. There's if you look economically across there's a fairly high correlation between, if governments invest a lot in healthcare, they get better health outcomes at the low income setting. That is not true of the US healthcare system. Separate discussion, separate dialogue. We can come to that if you want. But in general, in the low income context, you increase the spending, you have these kind of interventions I talked about in primary healthcare and vaccines and treatment, you will get significantly improved outcomes. In education, there's much less of a correlation. What you can get is outcomes, a correlation between the number of kids in school, and the statistic you just gave is, yes, there was a massive increase in primary school enrollment. Way more kids went to school in the 2000s, and there's up to now 90% of kids worldwide go to school, which is also a number that's higher than most people think. But learning outcomes really lagged and are uneven. And there hasn't been a high correlation between countries. South Africa, where that, my home country, and where that picture was taken, is one of the worst in that regard. It actually spends more per child than any other country in Africa and has worse overall learning outcomes. And the key is, what are the interventions? If there was a vaccine to create literacy and numeracy, we would be applying it everywhere. But actually, it's the system. It's teacher training, it's the curricula, it's the surround supporting ecosystem that provides parents and teacher training. How does that all come together? And there is, and what I'm saying is two real innovations happening. What we're there is one, there's been a huge amount of progress in what we call foundational learning, which is some basic techniques in foundational literacy and numeracy. So it's really between the ages of 6 and 12, which is our primary focus, that shows, and we've had some very robust tests that, particularly in India, but now increasingly in Africa, that have shown these kind of much more what we call structured pedagogy methods that help the teachers with much clearer modules of how they bring the students along and the students following, get you very, very significant outcomes, 2 or 3 times better than with almost the same amount of spending per capita. So now we're trying to both take that model and expand that globally. And this is one of the areas where the AI revolution, it has lots of potential risks and negatives. And I was just talking with President Levin about a lot of those. But it has some real opportunities too. And something like scaling education outcomes in low resource settings. If you're an overstretched teacher with 60 kids in a classroom somewhere, and you are able to have some basic access to a tablet and cell phone, it could even be offline, it doesn't have to be connected to the cloud, that's going through an algorithm that's allowing you to see where your students are struggling with this math problem or this literacy problem, allows interactivity from the students so they're able to actually engage and ask questions and get responses. You can get much, much more significant and genuine learning outcomes. And so that's what now our global education work, which historically we didn't invest in a lot in global education, not because we didn't think it was important, but because we just couldn't think what the interventions were, that we didn't want to just throw money at a problem for the sake of it. But with these kinds of interventions, and that's just from the beginning of last year, I think, that picture, we think there's some very exciting opportunities coming that are going to actually translate those children sitting in the schools to actually now getting significant learning outcomes.
So that's a really interesting example, Mark. So let's maybe do the following. So you talked about these interventions, and you talked about AI and digital platforms as a potential way to scale. So talk to us a little bit about, in general, how Gates uses digital platforms to scale success. But I would also, as you do that, whether it's in education or some other example, love to hear your thoughts about AI for good versus other ways that AI can go, and how you're thinking about that, even as you try to drive scale success in your interventions.
Yeah, well, I'll...
Only easy questions for you to answer.
Well, I'll use an answer because sometimes one of the risks we have being a foundation that was founded by Bill and Melinda Gates, who are both computer engineers with a fortune that came out of Microsoft, is we're often sort of pigeonholed or accused of being, are we just incorrigible techno-optimists who always think there's a silver bullet somewhere that we can do and that technology for its own sake is for good. But we've never thought that. In fact, the core founding principle is that innovation is critical, but whether it's innovation in healthcare, whether it's innovation in education, in agricultural development, which is another big area we work in, the market will naturally take that innovation to the wealthy. Whether it's wealthy countries or wealthy people within low and middle income countries, that's how markets work. It's the So you need a degree of intentionality. It has to be policy, it has to be financial resources that are actually going to take those benefits for the poorest and most vulnerable. And we're constantly thinking about how can you provide those incentives? Sometimes it has to be, that is one of the core roles for philanthropic capital. So sticking with a health example, one of the largest investments we're making right now, we're going to have ended up committing $700 million by the time a trial is over for a phase 3, which is the final phase of a trial for a tuberculosis vaccine, which is currently taking place in sites across Africa and Asia. And it's very expensive because it has to enroll tens of thousands of patients to be valid. Tuberculosis is still, most of you in the room may not know, it's the infectious disease that kills more people than any other still today. 1.6 million people a year, and many tens of millions who are ill with TB that affect their ability to work, their families, their lifestyles. But it's a disease of poverty. And because it's a disease of poverty, the private pharmaceutical industry, and the original product in this was developed by a private pharmaceutical company, wouldn't put the investment in to take it to scale. And because it's not something that affects people in wealthy countries, you don't get a big phase 3 trial the way you might for a cancer drug or something coming from a US or European funding. And so we see that as an appropriate role for risk capital for public good, 50% chance. Obviously, we desperately hope it will work, but we're realistic. It may not. In the AI space, that to some degree is both the biggest risk and the biggest opportunity we've been facing in our lifetime as a foundation. And I think it's a genuine global inflection point for the world at the moment, where clearly the AI revolution is real. It's transforming all aspects of the way we live and work. Its long-term ramifications are very unclear, causing deep uncertainty and obviously big debates about what's going to happen to jobs. You will be better equipped than me to talk about the potential impact on the job market of the future. But what it clearly has is some potential between when you talk about AI for good and trying to define what are the principles of AI good, what are the ways in which AI could be leveraged in ways that actually improve human impact outcomes across the world. And there you take an example like the global education one I just gave you is one very concrete one. We're investing in these. A similar one in healthcare, for example, is we've helped develop with a private sector company a handheld diagnostic device that you can literally plug into a cell phone and use as a sort of ultrasound thing, say on a pregnant mother, and it'll give you a low resolution image on your cell phone in a rural area. But cell phones penetrate just about anywhere these days. And then we have a customized AI algorithm which can use and analyze that and will actually give you an analysis which is as effective and as accurate as the most expensive ultrasound machine you will have in a local hospital here, and will allow you to triage a treatment of whether a pregnant mother needs additional care. And that same technology, we're cautiously confident is going to be able to be used to diagnose tuberculosis, potentially cancers, other things like that going forward. But we have to incentivize that. The market won't necessarily do that because there's a much bigger market in hospital ultrasound machines that you charge high margins for and US healthcare will pay for. And so we're constantly trying to find now with AI, what are the areas and partners we can do? And we're in very live discussions with nearly all the big AI companies right now, with OpenAI, Anthropic, Microsoft, Meta, Google, about potential partnerships in that space and what those look like. And I say it's a live discussion because I think there's interest and understanding. I don't want to, you can speculate on motivations from the companies about why they may or may not be interested in these issues. But I think there's a genuine opportunity to think through how can you use the AI platform? Can it really help in this context of cuts, aid cuts? One of the biggest sets of cuts has been to the provision of traditional AIDS treatment, both antiretrovirals for treatment and self-care. We're now experimenting in a couple of countries in Africa about self-care algorithms that can be used with AI to actually help patients so they don't need the same intermediaries that they used to do to get access to track their medications, to be able to track it if they go to different health outposts. We think there's a real opportunity there. There's obviously opportunities around the R&D side. And so look, it's early days. I definitely don't want to oversell it, but I do think both setting the principles for what AI for good could look like, which could include areas like how you ensure data protection, sort of health data, education data, because this is very important stuff, which is deeply sensitive for families and parents, in any country, and then create platforms and the condition of working with us, which has been true in any private sector partnership we do, whether it's in agriculture or health or now OpenAI, is we have a system called Global Access, which is actually a legal thing we helped create and pioneer and get permission from the IRS to use, which is that if you take our money, a condition of being a Gates Foundation partner is any product or anything that gets generated from our resources has to be made publicly available at the lowest possible cost. You can't use it for proprietary profit, if you like. And so our hope is that, even with all the other sort of risky areas of AI, which we might want to talk about a little bit more, that we're at a moment where in those kind of areas, I talked about health, I talked about education, we've had some really interesting models in agricultural development recently where you can provide, and I've seen an app working for smallholder women farmers in India that we helped support last year, which helped give them access to weather forecasting, direct digital soil health mapping. So they have very small plots of land, just a couple of hectares, but they can have access to, here's the kind of fertilizer you should use, here's the crop that would be optimal for your thing, here's when you should plant because here's when the monsoon's coming. And here is another thing where you could click back to the government subsidy or extension service support you can get. Those things are working right now. They're not scaled yet, but they have the potential to be really transformative.
Mark, last question before we transition to, let's get some other people into the conversation with you. You're so clear on so many things, and one of the things in which you've been exceedingly clear is on resource allocation. You had a podcast that you did with the FT where you spoke very clearly about this, and you said it's important that different sources of finance are deployed where they have the highest impact. Most importantly, that aid goes where other sources will not go. As you just pointed out, private sector is incentivized to do certain things, not to do other things. And you also said that the key to blended finance being part of the solution of private capital driving development is to be very specific and concrete about where we can actually expect private capital to go and where we can't. So it's a very important point, and I think it's a point that the private sector is particularly interested in hearing from you about. Whether there are other examples you want to share or to speak more generally about the importance of concessional or money or aid going to support things that only aid can support versus private money going to things that only private money can support, and the importance of actually showing where private money can actually make money versus saying, oh, we're going to get billions of dollars to go to trillions of dollars and so forth. Just would love to hear your thoughts on that for the private sector in the audience, Mark.
To answer that, first I'll just start with the aid number because you also need to unpack what aid is. When we're talking about that big number, yes, there's been a cut of $40 billion in aid. It was $240 billion plus in 2024. It dropped to under $200 billion in 2025. But even within that, you get to total aid to Sub-Saharan Africa was around $29 billion. Of that, a big chunk was humanitarian aid, which is really important, but it's life-saving in emergencies, droughts, war zones, floods. So the amount going to what we would call core development, the kind of investments in health and education and agriculture I was talking about, is an even smaller amount of that, call it $15 to $20 billion, which is still very important but diffuse. You compare that to high-income countries are allowed to spend on migrants living in the US or Europe. $33 billion of their aid money was spent in those countries on their migrants. That's important. We want to look after migrants and refugees. That's critically important. I don't think that should be aid. You shouldn't be using the same pool of resources. $44 billion went to Ukraine on its own, and that doesn't include military aid. Clearly, Ukraine needs support. There's a critical geopolitical issue, but don't call it the same kind of resources and then say aid hasn't worked. Narrow down, and so what we really about that core bit, when I'm talking about the 15 to 20 billion, or that's money that goes to the Gavi Vaccine Alliance or the Global Fund or the agricultural development. That's where our resources go, and I think it's incredibly important that that kind of grant financing, the cash money that entities like we can pay, goes to where, as you say, the public sector and the private sector won't do. The private sector won't do the risk capital for the poorest, so we should step in to do that. The public sector can't take the risks. Their job is to look at them, but they can't waste. If they can't waste $700 million on that TB vaccine, and because they'll be called to account for wasting taxpayer money. We can do it, and if it works, they can deploy it. And so that's the most important use, we believe, of the grant, the increasingly scarce grant concessional financing. And then what you have is a layering of the so-called capital stack, where there's been lots of slogans in development of, I think that was first coined that you can go from billions to trillions in 2015 at a big development summit I was at in Ethiopia. And the idea was you'll just leverage and crowd in the private sector. And those kind of bluntly platitudes didn't really get us very far because they're just too general and generic, and they're just not really true. They don't bear out in that, because it's not as if money comes naturally. It has to come to a sectoral goal. There's money that goes for infrastructure. If you look in climate change and things, a lot of renewable energy and related, they are critically important investments. They will generate a return. Should they be subsidized capital? Absolutely. You want to incentivize to do that. But does it need to be free grant capital? I don't think so. If you do it right, it's going to generate an economic return. You can look through different sectors. The sanitation sector actually will have some kind of return that's both a health return and an economic return. You can look in the agricultural sector, which I think is woefully underinvested in, particularly in Africa, as a potential for long-term return, because there are going to be, yes, it needs some basic early investments in loan capital for smallholder farmers to actually purchase the fertilizer or the seeds or other things they need. But you can actually generate, and entities like we can come in and provide the risk capital, or the International Finance Corporation or the Development Finance Corporation in the US. And being much more defined about which capital use, what rate of return, how do you do it, I think is an opportunity for the entire sector to generate much better outcomes, because you need to still generate the economic growth outcomes. And I certainly, maybe a good transition would be, I don't want anyone to think that when we focus on these human development outcomes, we're saying it doesn't matter to invest in broader economic. In the end, the true engine of poverty reduction and self-reliance is economic growth in countries, and then distributing the proceeds of that economic growth equitably, because that doesn't naturally happen, as we know from this country and many others. It requires a deliberate policy focus, and then within that, making those long-term investments in the human capital of the future, using the grant financing, philanthropic resources like ours, public resources like traditional aid, of which I think there is still an incredibly important role. And then ideally, if you can put all of those together, along with the pipeline of innovation that we have, of which AI is some of the most exciting, but not the only exciting innovation, I really think the goals that we aspire to for 2045, we didn't make them up like that UNMDG thing to be a slogan. We actually have a set of plans that if these actions are taken, we truly think we can get to a world where no mother and child dies of a preventable disease, and that anyone with a deadly infectious disease can manage it. And so that's our hope and aspiration for the next 2 decades.
Mark, that's on that note of extreme clarity and a beautiful synthesis of hope and reality. I'm going to segue to my colleague and your friend also and colleague, Jendai Fraser, to take us into the next set of the panel here. Great.
There. Good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to be here and to continue this program. As you heard, my name's Jendai Fraser. I'm part of Hoover's Emerging Markets Working Group. We have others of our colleagues here, Sanjeev Kagram and Anusha Shari, along with Peter, who I co-directed with. And it's my great pleasure to carry on from where he's left off. What I'd like to do is ask the panelists to come up, and I'll just give some very brief introductions, but you can see their full, or at least partial, because I know that they have so much tremendous experience. So the bios here are just highlighting, but at least you have that there. Mark has already been introduced, Mark Suzman, but the only parts of it that I have left to say is that he started as a journalist. That wasn't said, in South Africa. And I'd also, before joining the UN and working with Kofi Annan, and then going on to the Gates. And the other thing I would say about Mark's Gates experience, particularly for the students in this audience, is that he started at the Gates in 2007, and he was the CEO in 2020. So it took him 13 years in that organization, but he helped build it from within. So he did the work that led him to now be at the pinnacle and be the leadership. So Mark, thank you for your service at the Gates Foundation and for all of us. The next person on the panel is Dr. Vera Songwe, who is the founder and chair and CEO of the Liquidity and Sustainability Facility. She's also a visiting senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, co-chair of the high-level expert panel on climate finance. Previously, she doesn't like to go by, but I'm going to say she was previously the UN Undersecretary General and Executive Secretary of the UN Economic Commission for Africa, and also the Regional Director of the International Finance Corporation working on West and Central Africa, and a World Bank Country Director in West Africa working on a number of countries, Senegal, Guinea-Bissau, Mauritania, Gambia, and she has had many other roles at the World Bank as well. And so, Vera, thank you for being here. And I'm really looking forward to Vera's perspective, both from the private sector, but also from that of a multilateral organization and agency. Then we have Judy Moore, who's a lecturer at the University of Chicago's Harris School of Public Policy and non-resident fellow at the Center for Global Development. He served as a deputy chief of staff, and in that position, the head of the president's delivery unit for President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. Right after Liberia, she became the first woman president elected in Africa. And he was also the Minister of Works from Liberia from 2014 to 2018. And we're really looking forward to, Judy, you bringing some serious from the ground experience working in government, trying to address economic development issues, emergency issues, humanitarian issues. You've seen it all during that period. So we're really looking forward to your perspective on that. And then finally, we have my friend, Ambassador Mark Green, one of the former ambassadors in the room. He's had so many positions. He's the emeritus president of the Wilson Center. He was a former USAID administrator. During the first Trump administration, he was former U.S. ambassador to Tanzania during the Bush administration when we worked together very, very closely. He also was a congressman representing the Wisconsin's 8th District, where he had 4 terms before he then went into the executive branch. And he was the president of the International Republican Institute. And so what we're going to get from Mark is the perspective from a donor country, but also a perspective from a person who served both in the legislature, which is the one that controls the money, as well as in the executive, as in the administrator of USAID, and on the ground as the ambassador in Tanzania, actually having to implement these programs. So I think we have really a fantastic panel with various perspectives. I would encourage them, now I'll come and sit with you. I would encourage you to not just answer my question, but if between you hear something and you have a different view, same view, you want to give it a double tap, you want to say, I don't think so, let's just have a conversation across all of us. And so let me start with the broadest question, which is, how do you define development? When I think of development, I can think of it as a sector or a practice. I can think of development as the material changes in the lives of Africans, livelihoods and prosperity, much of what you were talking about, Mark. I could also think of it as inclusive and sustainable growth, the wealth in African economies. And so I wonder, how do you think about it? And particularly, how do you address the critiques of each one of those perspectives? When you think about it as a sector, you have the critique that this is really just an industrial aid complex, right? And that all of the money actually stays in the donor countries. They're not really getting, big organizations, Western organizations are the ones getting the money. And so it's a Washington Beltway game. When you think about it as the material changes in the lives of Africans, livelihoods and prosperity, the critique is the money never gets to the ordinary person, to the ordinary African citizen, right? So the money's somehow being diverted. And then when you think about it as development as inclusive and sustainable growth, the critique is that, in fact, it just perpetuates dependence of African governments. It's not leading to economic growth, and this is not the way to get through it. And I know that some of this is about conflating foreign aid with development, but given that sort of, the real stuff of the question about development and foreign aid, how do you see it? And we'll start with Mark and I'll go right down the line. I'd just like to get your perspectives on that set of questions.
Yeah, well, there's a lot there, and you've already heard a lot from me, so I'll give a briefer response now and then maybe come back on it.
Yes.
But I think my short answer, it has to be all of the above without the dependency. Like, we tend to then, I always like focusing, and I actually say it all the time at the Gates Foundation to our staff, that we're talking about impact, but impact measured in human lives. The impact, is it lives saved at its crude level for the very poorest, but then opportunities provided for the poorest and most vulnerable. And that's one important lens, which I personally believe is a critically important one that, does not often get executed on, whether you're talking Africa, Asia, Latin America, the United States. The needs of the poorest tend not to be at the forefront of the political debate or the public debate. And so I always want to keep that there. But you can't do it without broader wealth and income generation writ large. And wealth and income generation has to come from a degree of economic growth. And economic growth has to come from not just human investments, but broader economic investments across the economy, and putting in place a structural, sustainable. Sustainable is one of those words that get massively overused. I mean it in its literal sense of, it needs to be able to continue. That countries need to have the fiscal space to be able to make those investments over time. And I'll do that as maybe a soft throw over to Vera, who thinks a lot more about these fiscal space issues. But it's got to be about both the sort of broader development issues that are ultimately, the measurement has to happen also in the countries themselves. And that's why I keep coming back to the countries and communities. Yes, you can make your brickbats about the industrial complex, the role. There's some legitimacy behind all of those critiques, which is incumbent on all of us to unpack. But the shared goal has to be, strong, healthy economies able to invest in their own people for the long term.
Vera.
No, thank you. Thanks. First of all, let me start by, of course, thanking the King Center on Global Development for having us here, and for you, Jendai, for dragging us, bringing us, convincing us to be here for this very important conversation. Mark, thanks very much for the intervention. I think it is true that when we talk about development, generally, the first thing that we think about is the external impact. For me, development really is more about nations looking for how they can maximize their assets and how they themselves can make sure that their citizens realize their utmost potential. That is the very definition for me of development. It has to be that every citizen has agency, internal agency, national agency, regional agency, local agency to improve their well-being. And that collective agency then leads to maybe a binding social contract with leadership, authority. I think one of the words that you didn't raise in your conversation was governance and the organization of institutions. And if you have institutions that work, institutions that function, where then there is a collective definition of what prosperity and better well-being means, then you begin to have development. And if you look at it from that perspective, then development as you defined, which is it development of aid, it can only happen if that aid comes in because the population has had enough agency to direct that aid to where it wants it to go. Today we have a lot of aid that comes in because somebody comes in and says, I think what is important for me is this, and so you should do it because it's good for me. And that's not development, clearly, right? Because you don't have agency. But in the culture that we are in the situation where we're in today, if the populations don't have the education or the institutions to decide to make a budget that works, then it cannot work. And I think you said it, Mark, but sometimes it's useful to be clear. Now in the aid environment, we have the sort of 25% minimum of aid that must be spent in country. And I think the simple fact that we actually have had 7 years of discussion to say that 25% of aid should be spent in country is a travesty of the conversation. Because it means that if there is what you said, 20 billion that goes to aid, what is 25%? 4 billion? So essentially only 4 billion actually does stay in those countries. Only 4 billion actually does move that needle. And we do need to look at this and say to ourselves, what are we talking about when we talk about aid and development? And that's why if you then move it to a countries raising their own domestic resources and then being able to deploy those domestic resources into sectors that are effective and efficient for them, and leveraging then, development resources as an addition, as a top-off. And that's what Mark said, which is very important, that the current existing environment is now meaning that we're having development because finance ministers and leaders of countries are talking about health. Before, what they were doing was they were just receiving help. They were not developing. And so for me, development must have full engagement. Leadership, citizens, of course, finance because we come from that sector, finance ministers and central bank governors. But if you don't have that, I think we're not talking development. So development starts with that agency, engagement, and auto-definition of what for me prosperity means. And you asked about prosperity, which is a decision when I wake up in the morning to define my future, and the decision and the ability to actually then pursue that objective. After that, you get, the resources that come from the external. There's so many countries that have 60, 80% aid, whose standards of living have not gone up. And the last thing I would say is if we wanted one metric for development, which we don't have in the multilateral system, is to ask 70, 80 years later, how many and I see Louise here, who is here in the audience, and we've all been working together. We've been talking about low-income countries for the last 60 years. How many countries have actually graduated from that appellation? 3. So I think if we begin to have that metric of what success, just like I think that's why you succeed, because you have your metrics. 20 million women have gotten better, 100,000. We don't have those metrics in this general development terminology, and we need to add that.
Thank you. Judy.
And I would just continue what Vera said and say thanks to the King Center, but thanks to you, Jenna, for the invitation. And it's a pleasure being here. I think before I respond to this, I wanted to say that I've been in a lot of conversations of this kind where we speak about how much aid has been lost, how much of this has gone. And sometimes we actually speak about it as if it's an act of God. Like one morning we woke up and it was like something happened and no one knows. People were responsible for this action. I mean, the aid programs that were sort of canceled were themselves creation by other people. They didn't just happen as something that occurs naturally. And so I think it's important. I think if you ask governments like mine or at the project level recipients of aid and ask them if they had issues with development as it was before, they would tell you there were things they wanted to change. But no one asked for this sort of vandalism of the international development architecture that we've seen. However, here we are. And I think when I think about development, I think to Mark's point is all of the above. But I want to focus on the third. I think for a long time, the way development was practiced and the way we thought about development was we had these verticals. There were parts of the development architecture that focused on growth. There were parts that focused on health outcomes, education outcomes, gender outcomes, and all of those things were important. But I think growth is not simply a vertical. It is the architecture in which everything should happen. Because a country that is growing is expanding its tax base. A country that is growing and expanding its tax base can eventually pay for its own healthcare system. And so our goal should have been for us, the recipient countries, to work ourselves out of a situation where we're receiving aid. And so now that there's less aid available, I think we ought to reorient ourselves around that. But I should be clear what I mean by growth. Because there is now significant interest in African minerals. And that structural interest and demand for minerals means that for African countries with natural resources, there will be an increase in natural resource rents. And there's growth that comes from that. Right? If there is a construction boom, there's growth that comes from that. But that's not the kind of growth that I'm talking about. I'm talking about growth in the productive sector of the economy, growth in the tradable sectors of the economy, agriculture, increasing the use of agriculture, agri-processing, light manufacturing. Now, those are the load-bearing portions of the economy. 50 to 80% of the jobs created are created at. That's where we add value to our exports. And that part has been largely neglected. And so I think when we think about development, especially for us on the recipient side, it's time for us to think about how do we organize our governments? How do we organize our budgets so that this is what we're pursuing? And what I'm hoping is, I work with, I was on the other side of MCC, and now I'm working with MCC as a consultant, and I like the model. I think every country ought to do a growth diagnostic. Most poor countries have a number of constraints, but not every constraint is binding. So let's find the binding constraint to economic growth and design our budget around removing them. And so now when we're engaging with development partners, we can say, listen, we've done a growth diagnostic. Here are the issues that are binding to economic growth, and these are the issues we're trying to remove. Here's where we think you fit. We're in a place now where we have America First Global Health Strategy. I think we should have a Zambia First Global Strategy. Zambia can have its own strategy. And if the aid doesn't work with what Zambia wants, then Zambia is not required to take that aid. Right. But I think for us on the recipient side, now that the shock of an overnight sort of evisceration of USAID has happened, we can step back and think, all right, going forward, how do we organize our economies to be able to deliver for our people? And the final thing that I would say here is that when it comes to development aid, and I'm mainly thinking not humanitarian assistance, but ODA. My idea to that about that was sort of the Blackstone ratio version of aid, and that the Blackstone ratio, which has been sort of a centerpiece of Anglo-American jurisprudence, is we would rather 10 guilty people go free than punish one innocent person. And that's why even when we witness a crime, the accused is assumed to be innocent. I would rather the development assistance with all of its warts and dysfunction than some child or 200,000 children dying, or some woman without care, or someone with HIV/AIDS who can't have it simply in some form of trying to strike. So I think going forward, for those of us who support international development, those of us who pay taxes and want our taxes used in that way, I think we also have to have a voice about this. It's not just those who want to damage the infrastructure or the architecture of aid who have a voice. They're not the only ones who pay taxes. I think we ought to be a little bit more assertive in terms of what we want.
Thank you. Ambassador Mark.
Yes. Well, and my co-panelists, I think, have made a number of very important points. Maybe I can just add a couple of minor observations. So in all of my travels, Africa and other parts of the developing world, I have never met a leader who has said to me, I really want aid. It's a necessary evil in the minds of most. They take it because they need it. What they want to do is lead their own future. And so I think that's how we should be thinking about this. I think one of the reasons that we saw USAID and other programs, both sides of the Atlantic, so quickly dismantled is that we had these terrible stereotypes of the aid system. So somehow people thought that every leader in Africa is just waiting around for the phone call. They want to know how many buckets of money they're going to get, and they can, squirrel it away or something. Rubbish, of course. You have leaders throughout Africa desperately looking for ways to create meaningful jobs for that rapidly rising young generation. If we're smart, we'll be on their side for it. When I was at USAID, one of the things I used to do, and I saw one of my former colleagues here, he can vouch for it, I used to walk around the office to irritate my staff and say, just so we're clear, we don't actually do development here in the building. And we don't do development in Washington, D.C. We move money. We invest in things. And through the choices that are made, we can help walk alongside good leaders as they reach for self-reliance. My very first set of remarks at USAID, I walked in and I said, look, the purpose of all foreign assistance must be ending its need to exist. And a few people were startled and grumbled, and then they all said, well, actually, that is why we're here. And so I think that's how we should be thinking about it. What happened with this rapid dismantling, as you saw, it pulled apart regardless of whether the investments were making a difference and the investments were sound, and that was a tragedy. I guess what I will say, and maybe this helps to tee up the discussion, So when we saw these deep budget cuts, Europe here, and the dismantling of programs, yes, including USAID, a lot of people were sort of waving a banner of trade, not aid. So if 2025 was the most consequential year for development in a generation, it's nothing compared to 2026 and 2027. Because I think going forward is when we answer the question, that policymakers answer the question, was trade not aid simply an excuse to do less with less? Or was it a sincere down payment on a new system? And I think we all have to weigh in for the latter, because if we don't weigh in for the latter, we're going to get the former, and that'll be a tragedy, and we'll see setbacks. And Mark, you laid out real well the progress that's been made. I think part of it is that this progress, the ground shifted in ways that people back here simply didn't notice. They have these stereotypes, and they really didn't want to hear anything to the contrary. I mean, half of Africa is now middle income. That shatters the stereotypes that so many have. I remember once sitting in, it was the 50th anniversary of the DAC, Development Advisory Council, and we were talking about this notion, as Gates has it too, of sort of working ourselves out of a job and talking about self-reliance. And a few of my European colleagues said, well, we don't think that anyone's truly self-reliant. At which point the South Koreans said, actually, we think we are. A few others said, well, actually, no, we actually think so too. And that aspiration of wanting to be self-reliant, of to lead your own future, to lead your community's future, to lead your people's future, it's human nature. And so if we're smart investments that capitalize on that instinct, I think is what gets us there. Now, the final point, the Gates Foundation has been terrifically important because, as Mark alluded to, it's made investments in technologies and trials that we could never do at USAID. It would have put at risk taxpayer money. But some of what we've learned and then deployed, that offers great promise. And so, there are lots of things that worry us, but there's also, I think, a lot of hopefulness in what the Gates Foundation is doing and what the rest of us should be doing and looking for those places to make smart investments. As countries, as good leaders are seeking their self-reliance, we want to walk by their side.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Vera, I'm going to come back to you. You've written extensively on financing sources and changes in the rules of the global financial system as a necessary condition for Africa's growth and prosperity. Can you say more about the concrete changes that can be made today? For example, in banking regulations, I know you do a lot on that. Can you also tell us about your liquidity and sustainability facility and the role it plays in Africa's future development? And the reason why I'm coming to you is because I think that we can talk about growth and development, but there's a system there that is also a player in this story of development. And so I'd like you to tackle that. And, I'm going to ask each one of you, so you can just answer it as well as part of this, is how would you redesign the regional and global financial architecture for Africa's growth and development? Each one of you in your sector are going to get that question. So just be ready. For your sector, though, yours is the financial architecture.
No, thank you, Jen. Let me start by telling a story, maybe about you also. When I was at the World Bank, and Ambassador Fraser had just left the government, and we were talking about how wonderful the PEPFAR project was, and it is. And actually, going back to the development question, I think if one wanted to look for a good program that worked, and then do a compare and contrast, is maybe to look at what Pepfar did, and it's not because she's here, because she knows that, you know, we argue about many other things. But this is one that has worked, and I think it's that MCC Pepfar program, and the design was uniquely different from a lot of, I think, the other development programs that came before and after it. And I think if one way to think of, if ever there was a reincarnation of development aid in some sense, that is, I think, something to look at. So let me say that. But when she left, after having done that, and was now dabbling in the private sector, and I was at the IFC, the International Finance Corporation of the World Bank Group, and we had this discussion. She said to me, Vera, you know something? You guys just need to get yourselves out of everybody's business. She was saying, we, the private sector, think that you guys are not doing the right thing. You are undermining us. You're subsidizing when you don't need to subsidize. You're looking for the easy wins, and you just need to get out. And she was a very good friend. I'm like, I don't know, what is she talking about? Well, now I think so too. But, and I'll explain why. And there's three things happening on the continent and in the finance side. The first one, just sort of in terms of bullets, and I'll expand on each one of them, is Africa is an asset class. Nobody considers Africa an asset class. The minute you talk Africa, we talk aid. It's not a business proposition, right? And until we are able to see Africa as an asset class, and a diversified asset class at that, it's very difficult to have a conversation to actually, you know, look at what is happening. And I'll come back to why some of the things that we're working on. The second one is how we price risk on the continent. When we talk about Africa, the only thing we talk about is risk. It's risk from the beginning to risk from the end. And the final thing is, when we have decided that we maybe are going to try to price it as an asset class and we've understood the risk, we then create a policy framework that ensures that anything we've understood in 1 and 2 dies anyway. And so let me start with what we're doing. Liquidity. Today, if you're an African country and you issue a Eurobond, we all read in the newspapers it is oversubscribed. You issue a Eurobond in euros or in dollars, and you issue it in London, and I buy it. The day it becomes Nigeria paper, that paper is automatically risky. It is immediately, for me to then resell it to Mark is going to have to provision the 100% value of that paper in a bank to be able to touch that paper again. It's the same paper, huh? It just left London, came to Nigeria. Now, for Mark to take it, Mark has to put, let's say that he bought it for 100. Mark has to then put 100 in the bank to take the 100. So that's 200. That paper that was cost 100 costs now 200. Who wants to spend that kind of capital when there is no capital? So it's the capital charge on African assets is so high, and nobody wants to touch it. 1. 2, the international financial regulation says that if you're doing an investment, the same energy projects that you do in Liberia, that you will do in London, your capital charge, so the cost of potentially unraveling that project is going to be 25%. So if it's $100, you have to put $25 extra on the side to do that project. If you're doing it in Liberia, you have to put 50, double the amount, the same project. In a country, so 2 countries with the same fundamentals. So if I were a business person and these 2 people came to me and said, I have an energy project for you, the same project, I don't need to, all I ask you is, what's the capital charge in your country? You tell me 40 and the other one, 50, 49 to be precise, and the other one tells me 25. Where would you go? If you were buying ice cream and one stand said, you know, the same gelato, lemon gelato, same everything is $1, and the other one, same gelato, everything is $1.50, which one would you buy? The dollar. So nobody invests in Africa. This is a regulatory problem, and we've written about that, Jende and Peter. The third one is, we all know that projects are the most risky in their first 5 years, because it's difficult to get the permits, it's difficult to ensure that, your shipment will come in, and all kinds of other, sort of startup costs are the most difficult, the CapEx. A lot of studies have been done that show that after 5 years, actually, the riskiness of an African project is much lower, and a lot of that work is being done at Stanford, actually 50% lower than in European countries. However, if you invest in an African country, we ask you to hold that capital for 25 years. That is locked in capital when there is no capital available. So what do? I just make the cost of the project much more expensive, because somebody has to pay for me to make sure that I don't deploy my capital. So I charge the country that is supposedly poor to pay more to do that. These are the things that I think, and these are systematic policy issues inside the system. So it doesn't matter how well an African country is doing, if we cannot change this kinds of embedded regulation, cost of capital will continue to be expensive. It will become impossible for me. In the United States, passing collateral, it's something called the repo laws, the Federal Reserve, and everybody has done them, is the US Treasury bills have no capital charge. If I hold a US Treasury bill, I don't pay any cost for holding it. If I hold a Nigerian paper, I pay 100% for holding it. What do I hold? All African savings holds US Treasury bills. So all the resources on the continent move to America. So the poor are financing the rich. That is the interesting travesty of the financial architecture that we live in today. And until we are able to change that system, where all of the resources from the developing world are essentially sitting in US Treasury bills, because a system has been designed that says, you can hold this one for free, but if you hold this one, you have to pay 100% the charge. It skews the system. This is not to say that there is not risk in the developing countries. This is not to say that there is not difficulty. But it is to say that we need to take some of the inbuilt, embedded, accidental regulation. And the Basel regulation, and this is my last point, was put in place in 2008 because the world lost $15 trillion because some US financiers gambled. And global finance lost $15 trillion. So in 2010, we created Basel regulation. Since then, we have not had massive financial crisis. This is a fantastic regulation. So let me be clear about it. However, in 2010, Africans were not sitting at the table. Mark, you said it. Up until about 2010, if anybody remembers, it was about decoupling. The world had decoupled. This part of the world was going that way, the other way. And Africa was kind of forgotten. We were always the aid part. Everything else was happening, and then we had to give them aid. But today, Africa is coupled. If there's an oil shock, it hurts Africa. If there is a financial crisis, it hurts Africa. So we are in that system. So to design any kind of global regulation without wondering and asking the question, how does it impact this part of the world, I think does not work anymore.
Okay, we have about 10 minutes left. So read her work to get more of the answer, and all of them. But I want Judy to tell me about at the domestic side. What do African governments have to do, right? What do they have to do to move more towards self-determination, effective planning, execution, and coordination? Mark, Ambassador Mark, I want you to tell me what, from the perspective of the U.S. government, executive, ambassador, Congress, what does the United States have to do to be a more effective partner, a player in designing a development approach that contributes to the common good, a global common good, right? Which is economic development and prosperity. Mark, you're from the philanthropic perspective with a focus on health. What do we need to do in terms of the global health architecture? And what are you planning to do at Gates for the global health architecture to make it, like you said, no mother, no person dies because of health issues? So each one of you have very little time. You have a lot of writing, so the audience is not going to be denied your perspective if you don't give it all here. But and then I want to turn it over to the audience for questions. So that's why I'm asking you to just be brief, even though it's a big question. and then allow them to engage. And then we're going to have a reception so you can also get them there. So, Judy.
Well, yes. I think for us, this has always been there, but now it's more urgent and heightened than it was. And this is the more judicious use of the resources we actually have. A number of African countries, I think 45 African countries depend on natural resource exports for over 60% of the revenue. And so when I say judicious use of the resources we have, I'm thinking, as I mentioned earlier, about sort of a global demand for natural resources in Africa, critical minerals in Africa. The thing is, in a lot of instances, whether it's American, Chinese, European, or Indian, the narrative has not changed. Resources are sourced in Africa and processed elsewhere, so the value is created elsewhere, and maybe the finished product is sold to Africa. And if that is the case, then who cares if it's an American investor or a Chinese investor? The outcome is the same for an African government. So what we've seen is that at least 23 countries in Africa have passed laws or at least introduced some form of restrictions against the export of unprocessed commodities. I think that's a good direction to go in. However, I know there are a lot of African countries who want to go from extracting an ore and processing a metal. There are many steps in between. I hope they'll slow down a bit, right? So building the ecosystem for industrialization, I think that's an important thing. So I think on our side is to take what we do have now and extract as much value out of that as possible and look for the kind of partners who will help you to do this. And I will say this, it might sound as a surprise, but the country that has been most willing to invest in processing at any form in Africa has been China. And so if the Americans show up and say, we're designing our programs to counter the Chinese, if you're African, what are you talking about? So I think going forward, African governments now will have to be, again, I come back to that word, judicious. The Zambia has refused to sign the health policy agreement from the Americans. Ghana, 2 days ago, refused to sign. The Zimbabweans refused to sign. And Kenya is in court. Why? Because the Americans have tied what was supposed to be a health issue to natural resource extraction. So if you're an African country, when I say the judicious use of your resources, it means do what Ghana is doing. If what the Americans, what the Chinese, what the Europeans are presenting, if it's not in line with what gets you to what you're trying to go, you don't have to accept it.
Yeah.
So I'll actually build from that last point because I think it's a very good one. Every year for 36 consecutive years, China's foreign minister makes his, it's always a man, his first overseas trip of the year to Africa. Yes. China has more diplomats and more facilities in Africa than we do. So the first thing we got to do is be there and listen. It's number one. It's the first and most important thing that we can do. Number two, I think it's actually what you put out there is understated. I think you're starting to see African leaders realize that if they don't move quickly, they will be reduced to vendors once again. They want to be collaborators in the global economy. So you're starting to see more and more moves made to incentivize on-site refining, close at hand manufacturing, and they're looking for infrastructure to get goods to market. They don't simply want to be a blip in the supply chain, they'd actually like to be really strategic partners in the supply chain.
So,
if we were smart, we'd embrace that. I think it's a really good idea. And then I think most importantly, what we have to do is understand what all of these transactions that we're hearing about are not. They're not development. They're transactions. I like them. I'm delighted that the U.S. is able to find sources for critical minerals. We all need it. What we need to be doing is finding ways to help leaders turn those transactions into development outcomes. Tanzania next year 1 million Tanzanians will enter the workforce. 1 million. I promise you, there are not 1 million new meaningful jobs being created. We would be very smart to be on the side of looking for ways to invest and help to create those jobs. So I think that's key. You know, for years and years and years, we had business desperately trying to figure out how to reach out and work with government on development. It should be the reverse now, right? All of us in the public sector should be trying to understand the way the world is going and find out ways of helping to take those flows and turn them into real development outcomes, real development opportunities. In so many ways, the future flows through Africa. It's in our interest to do that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy.
Thank you.
Well, you threw me a bigger global health architecture question. So we'll come back to some of these core development ones. But in global health, just a broader observation that we've been focusing a lot on the USAID cuts and others, but a reminder that the first step the US government did was actually withdraw from the World Health Organization.
That's right.
It came before the destruction of USAID and has stopped funding the World Health Organization. And as a result, the largest funder of the World Health Organization remaining is the Gates Foundation. We fund more than any government. The next biggest is Germany, then the UK, then it swings down. And at one level, I get a lot of questions that come and say, well, why does an unaccountable philanthropy sitting in Seattle exert such influence over global that should never happen? I agree. And I go, you're dead right. It should never happen. The world should be fully funding the World Health Organization. For the best way to reduce our influence is fund what you should fund. And this comes 5 years after a global pandemic, which also caused $15 trillion odd dollars of economic damage and killed millions and millions of people. And yet we're not remotely ready to prepare for the next pandemic, which is going to happen at some point, let alone fully invest in those public health. So the global health architecture has the WHO at its center, but at these entities like the Global Fund and the Gavi Vaccine Alliance, there are entities like UNICEF, other parts of the UN do some work on that. The entire UN system, the World Bank and IMF are still largely well-funded, but the traditional UN system at the moment is a shadow of its former self, does not have the real ability to operate at scale currently, whether it's the World Food Programme, whether it's UNICEF. And in the health, I think that's most acute right now. And we're trying to think through what is the right health system of the future. Like any crisis, that becomes an opportunity. The UN system had gotten, I'm allowed to say that because I worked for it, there definitely are some truth to, there is some bureaucracy that is a little excessive, has historically been a bit excessive. There's duplication of mandates. There's too much focus on talking shops and people not doing what Marg was talking about, or subject to the error that they thought what they talked about in a conference in New York was actually making a difference in a country. There's a great moment to rethink that, but it needs to come through with a much more efficient, effective, fully funded structure that does address these big global problems. And so I'm not going to give you that recipe right now. I think it actually is an inappropriate thing for a philanthropic foundation sitting in Seattle to tell you what that should be. We can tell you what we think the system should provide. It should provide public goods around surveillance. It should provide public goods around best practices. It should require the regulatory approval of the things like the syringes in that photograph or like the next vaccines. There are a set of principles that need to be done, and there need to be pool procurement that is allowing you to leverage the private sector in smart ways in the way I talked about for HIV or vaccine provision. But right now we are failing on all of those, and that's just one symptomatic of a failure that is happening across agricultural support and development, the broader development infrastructure, and it's a corollary of what we've been talking about, but it's a critically urgent one which the world is not paying enough attention to.
Excellent.
Can I just add one point in sort of maybe alongside of what Mark's saying? Another reason that some of these structures, and another reason why longer-term compacts are so important, is predictability for our partner countries. In many cases, and I oversaw the implementation of PEPFAR in Tanzania, we're asking our partner governments to undertake pretty big reforms. They will do it if they know the money will be there on a consistent basis. If they think that next year the money could go away, it makes it hard for them to sort of rally the internal forces of change to undertake something if all of a sudden, whoops, money's gone. So predictability with these structures and the funding flows is really important if we're going to ask them, as we should, to undertake big reforms.
Yeah, excellent. Well, we have 15 more minutes left. I see a hand here in the back. Yes, yours. You got up first.
Mike?
Yeah, there's one.
Mike, thank you. Thank you all. As a person who's both worked in international development and done research on it, and a Stanford alum, I'm very glad to see you. I agree with Dr. Songwe that agency and engagement are really important, but too often I think we still see African and other governments taking what money they can or playing one donor off against another to try to get something that meets their goals when it's really the goals of the donor or the priorities of the donor that are too often in the forefront. Not always, but too often. My question is for Mark Green. I agree with you about listening, but I'm not sure in the U.S. now who would listen. Now that USAID has been fed into the wood chipper, as one of your former employees has very carefully documented, what kind of organization, development agency, or structure do you see being reconstituted in the U.S. to continue a mandate or a reformed mandate in terms of foreign aid?
I'm going to take 3 questions. Right here in the purple, and then right here in front of her. I'm coming this side too.
I'm also a Stanford grad, but from the business school. And Stanford Seed is a program that you're probably all familiar with it. It's developing business in low-income countries, which a lot of us had participated, who's in the audience today. I lived in Africa for 3 years as a business person. Now I have a project in Tanzania that I took over from USAID because they cut the funding. And it's amazing how much I can get done to get farmers their own businesses started and running with like $10,000. So my question to Mark Green is, why aren't there more business people in USAID making decisions on business development? Because the people I worked with from USAID never been in business. They've been in DC. And I had to say no to the program. They sent me to Tanzania. And the farmers knew exactly what I was talking about and said, yay, thank God you came. And so it's my 3rd year there doing chicken broilers in layers, and we're going to take the template out all over East Africa because people are not employed. There are no jobs, even for people with university degrees.
Thank you. Thank you. Right in front of you.
I'm Radhika Shah, founding co-president of Stanford Alumni Alliance on Innovation for Global Impact, which was just launched 2 hours ago here.
All right, yay.
And we are embedded within the King Center. Thank you, Kate, for your support. My question is around the architecture for getting people out of extreme poverty in Africa. What are the key elements of that architecture, particularly grounded in agency, dignity, sovereignty that some of you touched on? And is there a role for AI there? What else is, and is there a role for livelihood, innovation, and what are your thoughts on cash transfers?
And I'm going to take another question over here.
Hi, I'm Eliza Ennis, and I'm a PhD student in health policy here. And I'm really interested in what you may have learned about this funding cliff that was unexpected that could help us prepare for what in some ways is another funding cliff in 2045 with the kind of closing out of the Gates Foundation funding, and to what extent that you've changed some of the policies and approaches that you've had in the Gates Foundation to be able to prepare for that, as well as think about ways that you're collaborating with other institutions and with the country governments around that.
So I heard 2 for Mark, 1 for Vera, perhaps?
And then one for
One for Mark. Yeah, so Mark, Ambassador Mark.
Okay. So I'll try to weave them together. So one of the things that we tried to do at my time at USAID was to develop a set of outcome-based metrics, third-party metrics, independent, 17 of them, measured capacity and commitment with each country and plotted them to try to understand the characteristics of countries on their, what we call the journey to self-reliance. And then our goal was to make sure, and we were in the process of doing this, didn't get it all the way done, but that all of our programs and investments were tied to that so that we could actually make sure that we were investing in those things that produced progress. Difficulties, and I say this as a recovering member of Congress, Congress would come in and of course would superimpose their earmarks so that there was actually less flexibility than there should have been to do that. And that was a great frustration. But I believe in tying as much as you can to those central metrics. Secondly, with respect to business, the other thing that we did during my tenure, we created the first ever private sector engagement strategy that made it easier for businesses to actually participate in program design as well as simply bidding. Because for too long in the development community, when they would say, oh yeah, we work with 200 private businesses, well, they mean contracts and contractors. And contractors are important, but that's not really what people are talking about. And so we were starting to make that change, proud of the progress we made, and I'm really hopeful that at the State Department, as they stand up their process, that they will be incorporating those rules. They are using the terminology of self-reliance, and so I think it's promising. And then one other point that was questioned, I was partially addressed on, and that is when we take a look at so many of the most impoverished countries, particularly in Africa, they are resource dependent, extractive dependent, and they're also, if you look at the inequality coefficient, they're among the most unequal countries in the world. A lot of the investments that we hear about in critical minerals, again, I'm delighted that we're investing in critical minerals, but absent investments in domestic resource mobilization, in strategic planning, in capacity building, they have relatively little development impact. And I've said to members of Congress, selfishly, I've said, look at this selfishly. If you aren't helping a country like a Tanzania to create those good paying jobs when you have a median age of 16, you have inherent instability, and those deals that you cut, they may not last so long. So it is in business interest to invest in these kinds of investments that break down inequality.
Thank you. Vera?
Just two things. One, $63 billion last year left the developing world into the developed world. I think reversing that, the reason it's happening is agency. The developing world is refusing to default because they want to keep agency. So agency is so important. And essentially that is what is happening today. Is people are saying, I want to determine my development, so I am not going to go to you to tell me what to do. And so because of that, I'm going to pay. And that is, I think, when development becomes so difficult for them, we must ask the question. And I say this because there's a lot of graduate students in the room, is to just think about this sort of what we now call negative flows. where essentially the developing world is sending money to the developed world. And finally, your question on the women. I think that's what Jenny was saying, is that if you get us out of the room, women can actually do much better. And so there is, I think what one needs to do is run a lot more of those examples and then make them, I think, probably more accessible to the rest of the other countries. Thank you. Mark.
Yeah, well, maybe I'll cheat a little bit and also partly answer because Jude, the reference when you talk about the Tanzania agriculture example, I think is a very powerful one. And you talked about how agro-processing and agriculture is one of the biggest areas of the, and it's just a reminder that 70% of the world's very poorest people, who are mostly Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, are rural poor. Is still, there is an urban poverty problem, but it's actually, and it's that proportion has been rising, it's actually getting closer to 80%. There's an urban poverty problem, but it is rural poverty that you're really dealing with, and they depend on agriculture for sustenance and livelihood. And there are enormous opportunities. I mean, so you're doing it in chicken development because that's actually been one of the most exciting areas we've been working in the last year. It's both gender empowering because it turns out men don't really like farming chickens. It's not grand enough for them. But it's also highly nutritious, great income generation. You can actually develop, it's a climate adaptation play because we've actually been helping do the research and development on essentially drought-resistant chickens, which operate across East Africa and West Africa, and they become self-sustaining businesses at scale that have huge knock-on effects, including dietary impact, income generation. So it's a great example. And I agree, historically, the development community writ large has been very poor at providing that kind of advice and structure. And so you do need a different kind of ecosystem and shift, and you need it really driven by the countries themselves. And you can do that in other sectors. And the reason I play that, because actually that's part of my answer to the question about, hopefully it's not a cliff when we spend our last dollar at the end of 2045. But we are very conscious, so we talked about, in the ecosystems we operate in, our $9 billion a year, which will go up to ultimately meet that $200 billion commitment, does create in the R&D areas we work in, like that, no one else has been doing drought chicken research, turns out. No one else has been doing those TB vaccines. We absolutely need to be encouraging, at one level, a set of other funders to be tackling. Some of them we hope will be problems they no longer need to tackle, as I mentioned, like polio. So if that's solved, that's truly solved. You don't need another polio vaccine. You don't need more research. You don't do it. But you will need, sticking in the agriculture, you'll need a new generation of research into the new generation of technology. Is it drought and flood resilient crops? Is it livestock? And so you need a funding ecosystem that's part of what we're intentionally trying to build. And you need, back to the point about government prioritization and ownership with long-term predictability in the countries where we work. So as a reminder of program, when we started and when we talked about that start in 2000 of the Millennium Development Goals, remember that the majority of global poverty was actually in South Asia. Of the world's very poorest people in 2000, 2/3 were in South Asia and Southeast Asia, and a third were in Africa, and then there were some in Latin America and Central Europe, but that's the bulk. Today, that proportion has reversed. 2/3 of the world's very poorest are now in Sub-Saharan Africa. 1/3 are mostly in Southeast Asia, and still some. And this is at the extreme poverty level. There's obviously poverty elsewhere. But absolute numbers of middle-income Africans has actually grown significantly over that period. The population has just grown faster. So the proportion of poverty has grown a bit. And when you're thinking about population growth, that's crudely on the trend lines, population growth is going to be neutral in the Americas and Europe over the next 30 to 60 years. And it's going to be potentially an additional billion people in Asia and probably an additional 2.5 to 3 billion people in Africa. That's where all the net growth is going to be. And so you need to think about creating these ecosystems and structures. And so a big part of what we've been doing is actually trying to build our own ability to identify, learn with, and partner with the governments themselves, the institutional partners on the ground. 15 years ago, I was talking about my history at the Gates Foundation, but when I joined the Gates Foundation, we had no offices outside the United States. We kind of had a model which was kind of reasonable to say, well, we identify issues and we'll identify partners and we'll fund them and they'll figure out how to go and do that. the thing is, that's dramatically different. Our largest single office is in India, where there's actually been enormous progress, but there's still significant depths of poverty and health challenges there, and we work across South Asia. And in Africa, we now have 5 offices across Nigeria, Ethiopia, Kenya, South Africa, and Senegal, and over 200 people. And part of that is to be able to, they're not there to be operational doing the work. They're there to actually identify, be in dialogue with, find the local partners, find the institutions, the versions of those revitals or the schools or structure, because that's what needs to be put in place over the next 2 decades to make sure that when we do no longer exist, we don't leave that gap. That would be a terrible indictment for ourselves and the system if we were going to create a shock. But we hope there will be a degree of self-reliance, broad income generation, driven by agency, hopefully with the reverses of those flows Vera was talking about, which are critical. Like when we talk about those headline numbers of the tens of billions, remember, that's just the aid. That doesn't quite the recycled flows Vera was talking about. The net flows are way smaller than that. And so, yeah, it's a challenge. It's a challenge we've set ourselves. It's a challenge that I hope for the students in the room and those who are engaged in these issues, you'll be part of helping us identify what the right pathways are to help do that. But that's definitely our goal, is to not leave a cliff when we finally close our doors.
Well, I think that's a perfect note to end on.
Let me add before we end.
Okay.
Where we want to end is that in 2045, the stock markets that will be making the world work will be quoted in Johannesburg, Mauritius, Nigeria.
There we go.
And Abidjan.
Now, that was a hand of applause for Vera. Now give one for the entire panel. Well, let me just thank all of the panelists for a really excellent conversation, discussion, and for sharing your thoughts. I also want to give a special thank to the entire King Center and their staff for the excellent organization of this event. And I want to give a special shout out to Anwin, Wendy, Kim, and Taylor. Thank you for all the work that you've done. And with that, please join us for a reception. Thank you all for being here. Peter.